Hey guys, tonight we step quietly into a candlelit hall where stone walls breathe cold air and every footstep echoes with expectation. You're not seated comfortably yet, you're standing shoulder to shoulder with courtiers, craning your neck to glimpse a royal couple who barely know each other, while incense, sweat, and ambition hang thick in the air. Somewhere nearby, a bell tolls, slow and deliberate, reminding you that this isn't just a wedding. This is a survival mechanism. And honestly, you probably won't survive this emotionally once you realize how much of what you think is romantic tradition is actually recycled anxiety from centuries ago. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And while you're at it, drop your location and local time in the comments. I love knowing where in the world you're listening from, while history whispers you to sleep. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You begin to notice something unsettling almost immediately. Royal weddings feel ancient not because they're old, but because they were engineered to feel old even when they were new. Every step, every word, every gesture you'll recognize from modern ceremonies was once designed to anchor power in the deepest layers of human memory. You're not watching love, you're watching continuity. A mainstream historical fact most people gloss over is that medieval royal weddings were rarely private affairs. They were intentionally public spectacles, sometimes lasting days, because secrecy was dangerous. If people didn't see the vows, they might question whether they happened at all. And if they questioned the marriage, they could question the heir. And if they questioned the heir, well, that's how rebellions begin. You can almost feel the paranoia humming beneath the silk and gold. As you stand there in your imagination, you realize the crowd isn't just there to celebrate. They're witnesses, living, breathing, notarized documents. Their eyes are as important as the priest's blessing. This is why royal weddings feel ritualistic to the point of stiffness. They were never meant to be flexible. Tradition was armor. Here's the quirky tidbit most people don't expect. In some early European courts, bells were rung not just to announce the wedding, but to confuse evil spirits who might try to curse the union. Imagine that, entire architectural soundscapes deployed to scare off invisible threats. Historians still argue whether this belief was genuinely spiritual or simply a convenient excuse to draw massive crowds into auditory submission. Either way, noise equaled safety. Silence meant vulnerability. You start to see how deeply fear shaped these customs: fear of infertility, fear of illegitimacy, fear of assassination, fear of God. When you think of a royal wedding veil today as soft and romantic, you're actually looking at a descendant of something closer to a protective barrier. In some early traditions, veils were meant to obscure the bride's face from jealous rivals or supernatural harm. A queen unseen was a queen unclaimed, at least until the right moment. There's a gentle irony here that might make you smirk. The more timeless a wedding looks, the more likely it's clinging to outdated survival strategies. You're watching a historical fossil parade itself as romance, and somehow it works so well that you still recognize it instantly. You might assume these traditions trickled down from common folk to royalty, but it's usually the opposite. Royal weddings functioned like cultural broadcasts. When a king did something, lesser nobles copied it. When nobles copied it, merchants imitated it. When merchants adopted it, it eventually showed up in village churches centuries later. That's how power spreads, slowly, quietly, and wearing lace. One light joke slips in here because you deserve it. Imagine planning a wedding today primarily to prevent civil war. Suddenly arguing over napkin colors feels a little less dramatic, doesn't it? Another overlooked fact: timing mattered obsessively. Royal weddings were often scheduled according to astrological charts. Certain days were believed to strengthen dynasties or weaken enemies. You weren't just marrying a person, you were aligning with the cosmos. And if something went wrong later, say a sickly heir or an early death, people absolutely blamed the date. Mercury retrograde has nothing on medieval royal paranoia. The scholarly debates start to creep in here, soft but persistent. Historians still argue whether royal couples themselves believed in these superstitions or simply tolerated them as political theatre. Some letters suggest genuine fear, others drip with sarcasm, implying the royals knew it was nonsense but played along because the crowd needed reassurance. You can almost hear an exhausted prince thinking, "Fine, ring the bells, scare the demons, just let me sit down." As the ceremony unfolds in your mind, you notice how little the couple actually speaks. Silence is another form of tradition. Words were dangerous, vows were scripted, improvisation was risky. You didn't want a nervous groom saying something that could be interpreted as weakness. Even joy had boundaries. And here's where the ASMR calm sneaks in. Imagine the slow rhythm of the ritual. Kneeling, standing, kneeling again. The repetition isn't accidental. It lulls the crowd, it signals stability. It says, this has happened before, it will happen again. Dynasties survive on boredom more than excitement. A second gentle joke floats past. If these ceremonies were any longer, even the conspirators plotting assassinations probably nodded off halfway through. What really happened behind these traditions is that they trained people, generation after generation, to associate authority with familiarity. If something feels old, it feels legitimate. If it feels legitimate, you're less likely to challenge it. You don't overthrow something that feels like it's always been there. You start to sense that royal weddings weren't about celebrating beginnings at all. They were about pretending nothing had changed. New bride, same power. New king, same order. Continuity was the message, and love was optional. One more strange tidbit before you drift deeper. In some courts, the order in which guests entered the hall was more politically significant than the vows themselves. Standing closer to the altar meant higher favor. People watched each other more than the couple. The wedding doubled as a ranking update. Think of it as medieval social media, minus the filters, and with more daggers. As your breathing slows, you realize why these weddings still feel heavy today. They carry accumulated centuries of anxiety, repetition, and control. Even stripped of crowns, the shape remains. And as you let that realization settle, remember, this is only the surface. The deeper you go, the stranger it gets. You drift forward without noticing the transition, because royal history never really pauses, it just changes costumes. The hall empties, the candles burn lower, and now you're following a young bride as she's escorted through corridors she didn't choose toward a future negotiated long before she learned how to write her name. You're not walking beside her for comfort. You're walking beside her because this is where the truth lives, the bride, as political currency. From the outside, it all looks celebratory. Trumpets, banners, embroidered vows. But underneath, the math is cold and precise. A royal bride is not primarily a person in this moment. She is a solution. She is a border stabilized, a claim neutralized, a bloodline redirected. You can almost feel the weight of expectation pressing down on her shoulders, harder than any jeweled cloak. A mainstream historical fact that rarely gets framed this bluntly is that most royal marriages before the 19th century were negotiated years, or even decades, in advance. Contracts were signed while the future bride was still playing with dolls, or, more grimly, while she wasn't even born yet. Dynasties married ideas before they married people. The wedding day was just the receipt. You begin to notice how often the word peace appears in these agreements. Peace between rival houses, peace between warring nations, peace bought not with gold, but with a human life shaped into diplomacy. And once you see it, you can't unsee it. The silk gown becomes a flag, the crown becomes collateral. Here's the uncomfortable part. This system worked frighteningly well. Marrying a daughter into a rival court could halt generations of warfare. It could also create new tensions, of course, but rulers kept returning to the strategy because it felt controllable. Wars were chaotic. Brides were groomed, literally and politically. You watch as a teenage princess is coached endlessly before departure. She's taught language, etiquette, religious practices, sometimes even how to walk differently. Her old identity is being sanded down piece by piece. By the time she arrives, she's already halfway erased. A new name often seals the transformation, as if rebirth might smooth over the violence of relocation. A quirky but very real tidbit slips in here. Some royal brides travelled with instructions on what facial expressions were acceptable in public. Too cheerful could look frivolous. Too serious could seem hostile. Imagine being told your face is now a diplomatic instrument. Historians still argue whether these guides were meant to protect brides from missteps or to fully suppress individuality before it could cause scandal. You sense how loneliness becomes part of the transaction. These women were often forbidden from bringing close friends or trusted servants from home out of fear of espionage. The very people who knew them best were liabilities. So they arrived alone, surrounded by strangers who monitored every word. If this sounds less like a fairy tale and more like a hostage exchange with better costumes, well, you're not wrong. A light joke floats gently by because the brain needs oxygen. Imagine being sent abroad with a crown, a prayer book, and a list titled "How Not to Accidentally Start a War with Your Smile." Suddenly forgetting someone's name at a dinner party doesn't feel so catastrophic. You start to realize something else that's unsettling. The groom often mattered less than you'd think. Kings remarried for strategy, not companionship. Princes were interchangeable pieces in a system designed to outlive them. Love, if it happened at all, was a side effect, like catching feelings during a business merger. There's a lingering scholarly debate here that refuses to resolve neatly. Historians still argue whether royal brides understood the full implications of their role or were shielded by carefully curated optimism. Letters from some queens suggest brutal clarity. Others reveal shock bordering on betrayal once the reality set in. The truth likely shifts from individual to individual, but the system itself was brutally consistent. Religion adds another layer of pressure. A bride didn't just marry into a family, she married into a belief system. Conversion was often mandatory. Refusal wasn't an option. Faith became another currency exchanged at the altar. And if the bride failed to produce an heir of the correct religion, the consequences ranged from disgrace to imprisonment. In rare cases, execution. No pressure, right? A second gentle joke slides in. Royal marriage prep makes modern premarital counseling look like a casual coffee chat. You linger on the concept of value. A bride's worth was measured obsessively by ancestry, fertility rumors, even the health of her siblings. Courts gossiped like stock traders. One weak uncle, risky investment, one cousin with seizures, red flag. Human beings reduced to genetic forecasts long before DNA was even understood. And yet within this system some women learned to wield their assigned role with terrifying skill. They became intermediaries, power brokers, silent negotiators. Their letters carried influence disguised as affection. Their wombs dictated succession. Their favor could redirect policy. Currency can still circulate powerfully if you understand the market. You start to feel the contradiction humming. These women were both powerless and indispensable, replaceable and irreplaceable at the same time. The crown needed them, but rarely protected them. If peace failed, blame found an easy target. One last strange detail settles into your thoughts like dust. In several courts, brides were formally received by local nobility before meeting their husband, symbolically transferring ownership from one realm to another. The ritual was legal theatre, but everyone understood the implication. She no longer belonged to herself. As your breathing slows, you sense how this idea, marriage as transaction, never fully disappeared. It softened, disguised itself as romance, learned new language, but its bones are still visible if you look long enough. And as you drift onward, remember this feeling, because soon you'll see how even something as innocent-looking as a white dress carries the fingerprints of this same system. You barely notice the shift as fabric replaces parchment, because royal history loves disguising power, plays as fashion. Now you're standing close enough to hear silk whisper as it moves, watching light slide across a gown so pale it almost glows. White, you've been told, means purity, innocence, new beginnings. But as you stand there, you can feel how wrong that explanation is. Too neat, too comforting, too modern. White dresses were never innocent, not at first. A mainstream historical fact anchors you here. Before the mid-19th century, royal brides almost never wore white. They wore colours that signalled wealth, deep reds, blues, gold-threaded fabrics dyed with pigments so expensive they screamed power. White was impractical, easily stained, and frankly wasteful. That's precisely why it eventually became desirable. Only someone with immense resources could afford a garment meant to be worn once and never touched again. You watched the shift happen slowly, almost accidentally. When Queen Victoria married Prince Albert in 1840, she chose a white gown not to symbolize purity, but to showcase British lace manufacturing. The message wasn't moral, it was economic. Support local industry, but make it imperial. And because she was a queen, and because people copy queens the way water follows gravity, the look stuck. Here's the part that makes you exhale through your nose in disbelief. Within a generation, the narrative rewrote itself. White became synonymous with virtue, a marketing pivot so effective it erased its own origin. Historians still argue whether Victorian moralists consciously reframed the colour to suit their ideals, or whether society simply backfilled a justification for an aesthetic it already admired. Either way, symbolism did what symbolism always does. It lied politely. You start to see how dangerous that lie became. Once white meant purity, brides were measured against it. Stains weren't just embarrassing, they were moral. The dress turned into a test, a public, wearable claim about a woman's body. And in royal courts where gossip was weaponized, that claim mattered enormously. A quirky tidbit floats into view. In some European courts, tailors deliberately layered white gowns with detachable outer panels so visible wear could be removed mid-event, appear immaculate even if reality disagrees. Early image management sewn into the seams. If that doesn't feel unsettlingly modern, nothing will. You think back to Section 2, the bride as political currency, and suddenly the white dress makes more sense. It wasn't about who she was, it was about what she represented. Clean slate, untouched territory, no prior claims. The dress wasn't speaking to the groom. It was speaking to rival dynasties. A light joke drifts past. Imagine wearing an outfit that silently announces no prior mergers or acquisitions. Corporate romance at its finest. White also photographed well once photography arrived, which only tightened its grip. Royal images circulated faster, further. A pale gown glowed against darker backdrops, elevating the bride into something almost unreal, ethereal, untouchable, and once again, Distance equaled authority. But here's where the contradiction deepens. In many cultures, white is the color of mourning, death, endings, and you can't help but notice the irony. For royal brides, marriage often meant the death of their former life, their language, their family, their autonomy. The dress unknowingly told the truth from another angle. There's an ongoing scholarly debate here that refuses to settle. Historians still argue whether the adoption of white reinforced stricter sexual expectations or merely reflected them. Did the dress shape morality, or did morality shape the dress? Like most power dynamics, the answer probably spirals both ways. You imagine the weight of the fabric now, not just physically, but symbolically. Heavy with expectation, heavy with surveillance, every fold watched, every movement judged. White shows everything. That's the point. It leaves nowhere to hide. Another overlooked detail: royal brides often changed dresses multiple times during wedding festivities, but the white gown dominated memory. The public saw what mattered, the rest blurred into background noise. Optics over reality again. A second gentle joke slips in to keep things breathable. White dresses are basically the original don't sit down, don't eat, don't breathe outfit. As your thoughts slow, you notice how this tradition outlived the system that created it. Today, white dresses persist even when their original political function is gone, or at least disguised. People defend them passionately without realizing they're defending a 19th century PR campaign with a morality filter slapped on top. And royal weddings? They cling hardest of all, because abandoning the white dress would mean admitting the symbolism was constructed, and constructed symbols lose power once exposed. You let that settle, soft and quiet. Fabric as propaganda, color as control, beauty as instruction, and as the gown fades from view, you sense the crowd returning, because no matter what the bride wears, none of it works unless people are watching. And next you'll step fully into that crowd, into the real reason these ceremonies were never meant to be private at all. You don't step away from the gown so much as you're swallowed by sound. Murmurs ripple. Shoes scrape stone. Hundreds of bodies pressed together, all facing the same direction, all pretending they're here for joy, when what they're really here for is confirmation. You're in the crowd now, and for the first time you understand why royal weddings were never meant to be intimate. Privacy was a liability. The real reason for public ceremonies wasn't generosity or tradition, it was control. A mainstream historical fact grounds you immediately. In medieval and early modern Europe, a marriage that wasn't witnessed could be challenged. If enough people doubted its legitimacy, rival claims could emerge. Entire wars were fought over whether a wedding had been properly seen. So kings made sure everyone saw everything, or at least the parts that mattered. You feel the eyes around you. They're not admiring the bride's dress anymore. They're watching for errors, a misstep in the vows, a hesitation, a priest stumbling over a name. These moments could be seized upon later, twisted into legal arguments. You're not just a guest, you're a potential future witness in a courtroom or rebellion. Here's a strange but very real tidbit. Some royal weddings were deliberately held in open-air courtyards or cathedral doors left wide open so sound could travel. Bells rang not just ceremonially, but acoustically, broadcasting legitimacy across entire towns. Historians still argue whether this was symbolic inclusion or simply crowd management through overwhelming noise. Either way, silence was the enemy. You begin to notice how carefully the ceremony is paced. Slow enough for everyone to see. Repetitive enough to be remembered the same way by hundreds of minds. Memory consistency mattered. If people later recalled the event differently, doubt crept in. This was mass psychology centuries before the term existed. A light joke floats gently. It's like insisting on filming every angle of a wedding because you know someone will argue in the comments later. You sense the presence of guards, not just for protection, but for intimidation. Their armor gleams, reminding everyone that while they are invited to witness, they are not invited to interfere. The crowd is necessary but dangerous, always dangerous. Public weddings also functioned as loyalty tests. Who attended, who didn't, who stood close, who lingered at the edges. Absence spoke loudly. Being seen seeing the wedding was a political act. Refusing to look could be interpreted as refusal to accept the union. Another overlooked historical fact slides in. Foreign ambassadors were often placed prominently during ceremonies so their reactions could be observed. A smile could be read as approval, a stiff posture as dissent. Diplomacy happened in micro-expressions long before it happened in letters. You start to realize how exhausting this must have been for the couple. Every movement monitored, every breath evaluated. Love, if it existed, had to survive under a microscope, and if it didn't exist, well, no one was expecting it to. There's an ongoing scholarly debate that hums beneath the surface. Historians still argue whether the crowd truly believed they were participating in something sacred, or whether they understood, at least instinctively, that they were being used. The truth probably varies by era, but the system relied on one thing consistently: people wanting to believe their presence mattered. A second soft joke drifts by. Congratulations, you attended a wedding and accidentally became part of the legal infrastructure. Public ceremonies also neutralized rumor. If everyone saw the same thing, gossip had less room to grow. Or so the logic went. In reality, gossip never disappeared. It just changed shape. But rulers believed visibility equaled truth, and belief was often enough. You feel time stretch. The ceremony seems longer than necessary, and that's intentional. Long rituals discourage dissent. They wear people down. By the end, acceptance feels easier than resistance. Fatigue is a powerful political tool. One more quirky detail settles in. In some courts, detailed seating charts were archived after weddings, preserving who witnessed what. Proof wasn't just social, it was documented. Memory backed by paper, redundancy upon redundancy. As your breathing slows, you sense how modern this all feels. Live streams, press coverage, social media. Royal weddings today still rely on the same principle. If enough people watch, it becomes unquestionable. Visibility still masquerades as legitimacy, and as the crowd slowly dissolves in your mind, you're left with a small, hard object pressing into the narrative. Something passed quietly between hands, something circular, something heavy with meaning, because next you're going to follow the wedding ring. And what it was actually proving all along, you don't hear the ring so much as you feel it, a small, cold weight slipping into a warm palm, its simplicity almost suspicious after all the spectacle. Gold, unbroken, circular. You've been told it means eternity, love without end, hearts looping forever. But standing here, half asleep in the echo of the ceremony, you sense that this object was never meant to be poetic. It was meant to be undeniable. What wedding rings actually proved was ownership, obligation, and legality. A mainstream historical fact settles in first. The use of rings in marriage can be traced back to ancient Rome, where they functioned less as symbols of affection and more as contractual markers. A ring signified that a woman was legally bound, transferred from her father's authority to her husband's. It was less, "I choose you," and more, "This agreement is now in effect." You picture the Roman annulus pronubis, often made of iron rather than gold. Durable, unromantic, practical. The message wasn't tenderness, it was permanence enforced by law. And when royal courts later adopted and elevated the ring, they didn't soften its meaning. They amplified it. you begin to understand why rings mattered so intensely in royal weddings. They were portable proof, visible at all times, a quiet but constant announcement of status. A queen without a ring invited speculation. A ringless finger could unravel treaties. Here's a quirky tidbit that tends to surprise people. In some medieval courts, the ring was more legally binding than the spoken vows. If the ring exchange could be proven by witnesses or records, the marriage stood even if other elements were disputed. Historians still argue whether this elevated status came from Roman legal tradition or from the Church's desire to anchor marriage in tangible ritual rather than emotional intent. You notice how the ring goes on the finger deliberately, slowly, almost ceremonially exaggerated. That pause isn't for romance, it's for clarity. Everyone must see it happen. Everyone must remember it the same way. The circle closes, and with it, options. A light joke drifts by. Nothing says eternal love like a legally recognized piece of wearable evidence. You also start to see why left hands became significant. The so-called vena amoris, the vein of love, supposedly running directly to the heart, was believed to exist in the left ring finger. Modern anatomy politely disagrees, but the myth stuck because it was useful. It wrapped biology around belief, making the gesture feel inevitable rather than invented. Royal rings often went beyond simple bands. They were engraved, gem-studded, inscribed with mottos in Latin or French. But don't mistake decoration for softness. These details often referenced dynasties, God, or duty, not affection. Love rarely made the cut. Another overlooked fact hums quietly. Rings could be used as evidence in annulment cases. If a ring was missing, damaged, or claimed to have been exchanged improperly, entire marriages could be challenged. Tiny object, massive consequences. The finger became a battlefield. A second gentle joke slips in. Imagine losing your wedding ring and accidentally destabilizing international relations. There's an ongoing scholarly debate that lingers here. Historians still argue whether royal couples attributed personal meaning to their rings or viewed them purely as formal instruments. Some private letters suggest sentimental attachment. Others barely mention the ring at all, focusing instead on airs, alliances, and appearances. Emotion, when present, seems almost incidental. You think back to the crowd in Section 4 and realize the ring solved a problem visibility alone couldn't. People could forget words, they could misremember gestures. But a ring stayed. It followed the bride into daily life, into foreign courts, into moments when witnesses were absent. It was legitimacy you could wear to breakfast. And for queens especially, the ring worked both ways. It granted authority, queen consort, queen regnant, but it also confined. Remove the ring and status evaporated. Widowhood, annulment, disgrace. The circle closed tightly. One more strange detail settles into your thoughts. In some royal households, rings were catalogued and guarded like state property. They weren't just personal items, they were assets. Lose one, and it wasn't romance at risk, it was law. As your breathing slows, the ring's symbolism sharpens instead of softening. It isn't a promise whispered between two people, it's a signal broadcast outward, meant to be seen, recognized, enforced. And as that small circle fades from focus, something larger looms into view. Arches, altars, robed figures waiting patiently. Because soon you'll watch how religion stepped in to bless, monitor, and tighten control over everything you've seen so far. You move closer to the altar now, where stone feels colder, and the air grows heavier, scented with wax and authority. Robes brush the floor, Latin murmurs ripple like a low tide. This is where religion doesn't just bless the union, it claims it. You can feel the shift immediately. What was once a contract becomes a sacrament, and once something belongs to God, questioning it becomes dangerous. How religion tightened royal control was subtle, slow, and devastatingly effective. A mainstream historical fact anchors you here. By the High Middle Ages, the Christian Church had successfully positioned itself as the ultimate authority over marriage in much of Europe. Royal or not, a union without church approval could be declared invalid. For kings, this was both a blessing and a trap. The church legitimized power, but only on its own terms. You watch clergy step between the couple and the crowd, physically and symbolically. This isn't just about faith, it's about jurisdiction. Marriage becomes something watched, recorded, and judged by an institution that outlives any dynasty. The crown borrows legitimacy, but the church keeps the receipt. Here's the quiet brilliance of it. By defining marriage as sacred and indissoluble, the church made political alliances harder to undo. Divorce wasn't just inconvenient, it was sinful. That meant fewer impulsive separations, fewer chaotic remarriages, fewer destabilizing claims. Stability disguised as morality. A quirky tidbit drifts into view. Medieval churches often kept detailed marriage records, not for romance, but for inheritance disputes. Baptisms, marriages, deaths. This holy paperwork controlled who could inherit land, titles, and thrones. Historians still argue whether the church realized just how powerful this record-keeping would become, or whether it stumbled into bureaucratic dominance by accident. You notice how vows are framed: obedience, duty, God as witness. These words don't invite negotiation, they close doors. Once spoken, the couple isn't just bound to each other, they're bound to an invisible authority that doesn't sleep and doesn't forget. A light joke floats by, because even cathedrals need oxygen. Nothing says romance like eternal oversight by an all-seeing institution. Religion also standardized marriage across borders, different kingdoms, same rituals, same prayers, same structure. This uniformity made royal unions easier to recognize internationally. A wedding blessed in one realm could be accepted in another. Spiritual interoperability, if you will, but with standardization came surveillance, confession, moral judgment, sexual expectations. The church didn't just care that royals married, it cared how they behaved afterward. Infertility could be framed as divine punishment, miscarriage as moral failure. A queen's body became theological territory. There's an ongoing scholarly debate humming here. Historians still argue whether the church genuinely believed it was protecting women by sanctifying marriage, or whether it primarily sought to control inheritance and sexual behavior. The truth likely sits uncomfortably in between, shifting with time, place, and politics. You sense how trapped some rulers felt. They needed the church's blessing to rule effectively, but that blessing came with strings. Kings negotiated annulments through accusations of consanguinity, being too closely related, sometimes retroactively discovering cousins where none had mattered before. Faith bent when power insisted, but never without cost. A second gentle joke slips in. Nothing like suddenly realizing you're related when a divorce would be politically convenient. Religion also shaped spectacle. Cathedrals weren't chosen for intimacy, they were chosen for awe. Height, echo, light, filtering through stained glass. You didn't just witness a wedding, you felt small inside it. And small people are easier to govern. One more overlooked detail settled softly. Sermons delivered during royal weddings often emphasized obedience to divine order more than love between spouses. The message was clear: this marriage mattered because God said so, not because the couple felt anything at all. As your breathing slows, you feel how deeply this religious framework fused with royal tradition. Even when belief faded, the structure remained. The words kept being spoken, the rituals kept tightening their grip. And as the last echo of prayer dissolves into silence, you sense a shift towards something far less spiritual and far more invasive, because next You're going somewhere few people like to imagine, but everyone once accepted. You're about to witness the bed ceremony. You don't leave the ceremony so much as you're escorted somewhere quieter, heavier, and far more uncomfortable. The music fades, the crowd thins, but not enough. Torches flicker along a corridor leading to a chamber where the air smells of linen, wax, and expectation. This is the part of the wedding no one puts on souvenir plates. This is the bed ceremony, and once you see it, you can't pretend royal marriages were ever private. The bed ceremony was not a joke, not a prank, and definitely not optional. A mainstream historical fact anchors you immediately. In many medieval and early modern European courts, it was customary for witnesses to accompany newlyweds to the marriage bed. Nobles, clergy, and family members observed the couple being undressed, blessed, and placed into bed together. Sometimes curtains were drawn, sometimes they weren't. The purpose was simple and brutal. Proof of consummation. You feel the second-hand embarrassment seep in slowly. The bride, barely settled into a new country, now performs the final requirement of legitimacy under watchful eyes. The groom, equally exposed, understands that failure here has consequences far beyond personal humiliation. This isn't intimacy, it's verification. Here's the quirky but very real tidbit. In some courts, witnesses remained long enough to hear sounds from behind the curtains. In others, bedding stained afterward could be displayed as evidence. Historians still argue whether this practice was widespread or exaggerated by later scandal-hungry chroniclers, but enough records exist to confirm it wasn't rare, and it wasn't symbolic, it was procedural. You start to see why this mattered so much. Remember the paranoia about heirs, treaties, and legitimacy. Consummation was the switch that turned a marriage from potential to active. Without it, the union could be annulled. With it, undoing the marriage became exponentially harder. The bed was a legal threshold. A light joke drifts in gently because the mind needs relief. Imagine inviting half your extended family to confirm you did, in fact, go to bed on time. The bed itself was often blessed, sometimes with holy water, sometimes with prayers focused obsessively on fertility. God wasn't just invited into the marriage, he was stationed bedside. Religion and surveillance overlapped seamlessly here, closing the loop between sacrament and biology. You notice how gendered the scrutiny is. Queens bore the brunt of suspicion. If no heir appeared months later, fingers pointed quickly. Was she barren? Was she resisting? Was she cursed? Kings were rarely blamed with the same urgency. Power insulated them. Biology did not. There's an ongoing scholarly debate humming beneath the sheets. Historians still argue whether couples found ways to subvert the ceremony, delaying consummation, performing it privately later, or staging evidence. Some letters hint at quiet resistance, others suggest resignation. The truth likely varies, but the pressure was constant. Another overlooked detail settles in. Bed ceremonies also functioned as status theatre. Who was allowed in the room? Who stood closest? Who handled the bedding? These roles signaled hierarchy. Even in this most intimate moment, rank mattered. A second gentle joke slips by. Nothing kills the mood like a seating chart. You begin to understand how trauma could hide behind ritual. For young brides especially, this was not merely embarrassing, it was frightening. Consent, as you'd recognize it today, barely existed in this context. Obligation ruled, silence was expected, and yet courts justified it all in the name of order. The bed ceremony prevented disputes, they said. It protected the realm. It ensured stability. Individual discomfort was a small price for dynastic continuity, or at least that's how the story went. As your breathing slows, the room dims, curtains close, witnesses withdraw finally. What remains is the quiet aftermath of a tradition that prioritized proof over privacy. And as you step back from the bed, you realize something unsettling. Even once the doors closed, performance didn't stop. Because next, you'll see how even the smallest gestures, like a kiss, were calculated, rationed, and choreographed for power. You step away from the bedchamber with a strange sense of relief, only to realize the performance never actually ended. It just shifted scale. Now you're back in public view, where something as small as a kiss carries more weight than an entire night behind closed doors. Lips touch briefly, carefully, and everyone leans in, not for romance, but for reassurance. Why royal kisses were choreographed becomes obvious the moment you watch one too closely. A mainstream historical fact settles in. For much of European history, public displays of affection among royalty were rare and tightly controlled. When they did occur, especially during weddings, they were symbolic gestures meant to signal unity and legitimacy, not passion. A kiss was an announcement, not an impulse. You start to notice how restrained it is. Short, measured. Often more cheek than mouth, long enough to be seen, not long enough to invite speculation. Too much enthusiasm could look undignified, too little could look cold. The sweet spot was political neutrality disguised as tenderness. Here's a quirky tidbit that feels oddly modern. Some courts explicitly instructed royal couples on how to perform public affection, where to place hands, how long to hold contact, when to release. Historians still argue whether these guidelines were about decorum or about limiting emotional visibility to maintain authority. Either way, spontaneity wasn't welcome. You remember the crowd from earlier sections and realize this kiss is for them. It says, yes, the union is real. Yes, harmony exists. No, you don't need to worry. It's a seal on the spectacle. A light joke drifts through. Congratulations, you've just witnessed the world's most strategic peck. Kisses also functioned as damage control. After scandals, rumors, or political tension, public affection could smooth things over. A well-timed kiss was a press release before press releases existed. Silence bred doubt, contact reassured. You notice how uneven the expectations were. Queens were expected to display warmth without impropriety. Kings were allowed a bit more reserve, too affectionate, and a queen risked being labelled frivolous, too distant, and she risked being called cold or disloyal. Emotional labour performed live. There's an ongoing scholarly debate here that lingers like a held breath. Historians still argue whether these displays reflected genuine private affection or whether they actively shaped it, forcing couples into emotional scripts that later bled into real relationships. Performance has a way of becoming habit. Another overlooked detail, kisses were often placed at carefully chosen moments, after vows, during feasts, or in response to cheering crowds. Timing mattered. A kiss at the wrong moment could overshadow a religious rite or offend protocol. Yes, even kissing had rules. A second gentle joke slips in. Imagine needing approval from 3 advisors before leaning in. As your thoughts slow, you sense how intimacy itself became currency. What was shown publicly increased trust in the regime. What was withheld maintained mystique. Royals learned to ration themselves the way states rationed grain. And this choreography didn't stop at weddings. It followed couples into coronations, public appearances, even portraits. A hand resting lightly on an arm, a shared glance frozen in paint. Every gesture archived. You begin to see the pattern clearly now. Bodies, clothing, words, beds, kisses, all regulated, all staged, all serving the same quiet goal, stability through performance. And as that realization settles, something colder creeps in. Because next, you'll feel the pressure that outlasted every ceremony, every kiss, every costume, the obsession with fertility. You don't need to be told what comes next. You can already feel it ticking in the background, like a clock no one dares to mention out loud. The ceremony is over, the kiss has been approved, the bed has been witnessed, and now the waiting begins, because for a royal marriage, everything funnels toward one outcome: proof of fertility. The dangerous obsession with fertility wasn't subtle, it was relentless. A mainstream historical fact grounds you here. Producing an heir was the primary measure of success for royal marriages. Love, compatibility, even political harmony mattered far less than a living, legitimate child, preferably male, preferably quickly. Months without pregnancy sparked whispers, years invited crisis. You imagine the Queen waking each morning already under surveillance, her cycle monitored by physicians, her diet adjusted by advisors, her body discussed in council chambers she'd never enter. She wasn't just a wife, she was a timeline. Here's the unsettling but fascinating tidbit. Early modern courts employed fertility specialists whose advice ranged from herbal remedies to astrological timing to frankly bizarre prescriptions. Certain positions, foods, lunar phases, historians still argue whether these practices were grounded in genuine medical belief or served primarily to give anxious courts a sense of control over something fundamentally unpredictable. You sense how blame moved quickly and unevenly. If no heir appeared, suspicion fell on the woman first, always. Kings might quietly father illegitimate children, evidence of virility that somehow never absolved their wives. Queens carried the burden of proof in silence. A light joke floats in carefully. Imagine your entire job performance review hinging on biology doing its thing on schedule. Religion tightened the vise. Fertility was framed as divine approval, barrenness as punishment, miscarriage as moral failure. A queen grieving privately still had to endure public speculation about what she'd done wrong. Prayer became prescription. There's an ongoing scholarly debate humming beneath the pressure. Historians still argue whether some queens were unfairly labelled infertile when the issue may have been male factor infertility, a concept poorly understood at the time. Power-shaped diagnosis. Medicine followed hierarchy. You notice how time compresses for these women. Youth became currency. Aging was a threat. A queen who failed to conceive early risked being replaced, sidelined or discarded. New wives appeared. Old ones faded from records. Another overlooked fact settles in. Pregnancies themselves were political events. Announcements were delayed or rushed, depending on strategy. Birth chambers filled with witnesses to prevent baby-switching rumors. Even childbirth wasn't private, especially childbirth. A second gentle joke slips by. Royal babies had better attendance than most modern conferences. You feel the emotional cost deepen. Hope rises, hope collapses over and over. Each month without success compounds fear. Not just personal fear, but fear of disgrace, annulment, or worse. And yet some queens wielded this obsession strategically. They timed announcements, they leveraged pregnancy to gain influence. They negotiated protections while they were valuable. Fertility could trap, but it could also empower briefly. As your breathing slows, you sense how cruelly efficient the system was. Reduce a human life to one biological function. Reward success. Punish failure. Call it destiny. And when an heir finally arrived, the obsession didn't end, it shifted outward. Celebration became spectacle. Feasts exploded across courts and cities, not just to rejoice, but to broadcast success. Because next, you'll walk into those feasts and see how food itself became a language of power. You follow the sound before you see anything, the clatter of dishes, the low thunder of conversation, the hum of satisfaction. After all the tension, all the scrutiny, all the waiting, the feast arrives like a sanctioned exhale. Long tables stretch under vaulted ceilings, heavy with meat, fruit, sugar sculptures, and meaning. This isn't just a celebration, it's a declaration. What food and feasts signaled at royal weddings was power, abundance, and control over survival itself. A mainstream historical fact settles in. Royal wedding feasts often consumed resources equivalent to months of ordinary household food budgets. Dozens of courses, exotic spices, imported wines. The point wasn't taste, it was excess. If a ruler could feed thousands lavishly, they could rule them confidently. You notice how the menu reads like a map of influence: spices from the east, sugar from colonial plantations, fish from distant coasts. Every bite tells a story about trade routes, conquest, and reach. You're not just eating, you're being reminded who controls what. Here's a quirky but revealing tidbit. Medieval sugar sculptures, castles, animals, mythological scenes were displayed like trophies and sometimes never eaten at all. They existed purely to be seen. Historians still argue whether these displays were culinary art or early propaganda installations, but their purpose was clear: intimidate through spectacle. Seating matters again. Of course it does. Where you sit determines what you eat. Proximity to the couple equals better food, better portions, better status. Hunger and hierarchy intertwine seamlessly. Even celebration reinforces rank. A light joke drifts through. Nothing says long live the dynasty like a 6-hour meal you're not allowed to enjoy fully. Feasts also functioned as public reassurance. After all the secrecy and control, this was visible proof that the marriage benefited everyone. Food pacified. Full stomachs dulled dissent. It's hard to revolt while chewing. You notice how fertility themes sneak back in. Certain foods symbolized abundance: eggs, breads, fruits. Dishes were chosen for what they represented as much as for how they tasted. Even the menu whispered prayers. Another overlooked detail: leftovers from royal feasts were often distributed to the poor. Charity wasn't just kindness, it was messaging. The crown provides, the crown nourishes, loyalty follows. There's an ongoing scholarly debate simmering beneath the platters. Historians still argue whether these feasts genuinely fostered goodwill or merely performed it. Did people feel grateful or simply overwhelmed? The line between generosity and domination is thin. A second gentle joke slips by. Medieval feasts were basically PowerPoints made of meat. As your breathing slows, you realize food was one of the few languages everyone understood. You didn't need to read Latin or understand treaties to feel the weight of abundance. The message sank in through the senses. And when the tables finally emptied and the noise faded, something else remained visible. Long after the dishes were cleared. The clothes. Because next you'll look closely at what those layers of fabric were really doing to the bodies inside them. You notice the silence first, the soft hush that falls once plates are cleared, and attention drifts back to appearances. Fabric rustles, jewels catch the light, clothing once again takes center stage. But now you're looking differently. You're not admiring beauty anymore. You're reading structure. How dresses hid fear and control becomes obvious when you stop seeing them as fashion and start seeing them as architecture. A mainstream historical fact anchors you here. Royal wedding attire was often designed to be physically restrictive. Corsets, stays, heavy skirts, layered understructures. These garments shaped posture, limited movement, and enforced a visual ideal of composure. Stillness equaled dignity. Discomfort equaled discipline. You imagine standing in those clothes for hours, breathing shallowly, moving carefully, the body trained into submission through fabric. A queen who fidgeted looked weak. A bride who moved too freely invited judgment. Here's the quirky tidbit that makes you wince. Some royal corsets were reinforced with whalebone or metal, and young brides were laced tightly to achieve fashionable silhouettes. Historians still argue whether health concerns were understood and ignored or genuinely misunderstood, but fainting at court was common enough to be considered normal. You start to see how control operated invisibly. No guard needed when clothing itself policed behavior. The body learned its limits. Over time, obedience became muscle memory. A light joke drifts in, medieval shapewear because freedom was out of fashion. Dresses also communicated hierarchy. The width of a skirt signaled space one was entitled to occupy. Trains required attendance, advertising importance. You didn't just wear power, you took up room with it. Another overlooked fact settles in. Jewels sewn into gowns weren't just decoration. They were portable wealth, insurance in unstable courts. A queen could flee with her dress and still carry a fortune. Security stitched into silk. There's an ongoing scholarly debate humming here. Historians still argue whether these restrictive fashions were imposed entirely by patriarchal control or partly embraced by women as tools of status and influence. The truth, as always, is complicated. Constraint can coexist with agency. A second gentle joke slips by. Nothing says all eyes on me like needing 3 people to help you sit down. As your breathing slows, you feel how clothing outlasts bodies. Styles persist long after their original logic fades. Even today, echoes remain. Heels, tailored suits, posture rules. The body still learns obedience through design, and beneath all that fabric, something else kept moving, quiet, invisible, dangerous. Rumor. Because next, you'll lean in close and listen to how gossip and scandal shaped royal marriages just as powerfully as crowns ever did. You don't hear gossip announced. It arrives sideways, on a breath, behind a fan, folded into a smile that lingers half a second too long. As the court settles into its routines, rumor becomes the background hum, soft, constant, impossible to silence. You quickly realize that royal marriages weren't shaped only by vows or treaties, but by what people whispered when they thought no one important was listening. The role of gossip and scandal was never secondary, it was structural. A mainstream historical fact grounds you here. Courts functioned as dense, social ecosystems where information traveled faster than official declarations. Letters were intercepted, servants overheard everything. Reputation could rise or collapse without a single public act. For royal marriages, perception often mattered more than truth. You feel how fragile everything suddenly seems. A queen doesn't need to be unfaithful to be accused of it. A delayed pregnancy doesn't need an explanation to invite suspicion. Gossip thrives on gaps, and royal life was full of them. Here's a quirky but revealing tidbit. Some European courts employed official or unofficial listeners, individuals tasked with gathering rumors and reporting them upward. Historians still argue whether these figures were proto-intelligence agents or simply well-connected gossips elevated to state function, but either way, whispers became data. You notice how scandal disproportionately targets women, always. A king's affairs might be tolerated, joked about, even expected. A queen's alleged indiscretion could threaten succession, trigger imprisonment, or justify annulment. Gossip wasn't equal opportunity. It followed power lines. A light joke drifts in softly. Imagine your group chat determining the fate of the empire. Gossip also crossed borders. Foreign courts traded rumors like currency, using them to weaken rivals or pressure alliances. A marriage once meant to stabilize relations could be undermined by carefully planted doubt. Truth was optional. Timing was everything. There's an ongoing scholarly debate humming here. Historians still argue whether certain infamous scandals were organic or deliberately manufactured. Some accusations appear suspiciously convenient, emerging just as political needs shifted. Scandal, it seems, could be summoned. Another overlooked detail settles in. Silence itself could become gossip. A queen who withdrew from public view invited speculation. Privacy looked like secrecy. Secrecy looked like guilt. Visibility, once again, masqueraded as virtue. A second gentle joke slips by when doing nothing is somehow the worst possible PR move. You start to feel how exhausting this was, living not just under observation but under interpretation. Every action read, every pause analyzed. The wedding might be over, but the performance never stopped. And sometimes gossip succeeded where force failed. It softened resistance, justified removals, rewrote narratives. It turned private discomfort into public threat. As your breathing slows, you realize rumor was the shadow twin of ceremony. One showed what power wanted you to see. The other filled in what it couldn't control. And that tension leads somewhere dangerous. Because next, you'll see why something as human as love itself became a liability for royal marriages. You might expect love to be the reward after all this effort. The treaties signed, the rituals endured, the rumors survived. But as you drift deeper into the private spaces of royal life, you realize something quietly unsettling. Love wasn't just unnecessary, it was dangerous. Why love was a royal liability becomes clear the moment you imagine it appearing where it wasn't planned. A mainstream historical fact anchors you here. Throughout much of royal history, marriages based on personal affection were discouraged, sometimes outright forbidden. Love threatened predictability. It created loyalties that didn't align neatly with dynastic goals. A king in love could make reckless decisions. A queen in love could prioritize a person over a realm. You picture councils whispering behind closed doors, wary not of hatred, but of attachment. Emotional bonds couldn't be negotiated like treaties. They couldn't be transferred, annulled, or easily replaced. Love introduced variables power hated. Here's a quirky but telling tidbit. Several European monarchs were explicitly advised to keep mistresses rather than grow emotionally close to their wives. The logic was chilling but clear. Mistresses absorbed affection, leaving marriages clean, functional, and politically neutral. Historians still argue whether this advice was cynical realism or a deliberate attempt to compartmentalize power away from emotion. You notice how affection becomes suspect. A royal couple seen laughing together too freely might invite rumors of favoritism, shared influence, private plotting. Intimacy blurred boundaries that systems relied on remaining rigid. A light joke drifts in carefully. Nothing ruins a perfectly arranged marriage like actually liking each other. Love also complicated succession. Favoritism toward children born of affection rather than strategy could destabilize inheritance. Courts preferred clarity over warmth. A predictable line of heirs mattered more than parental attachment. There's an ongoing scholarly debate humming beneath this tension. Historians still argue whether suppressing love made royal marriages more stable or quietly more volatile. Emotional repression doesn't erase desire, it redirects it, often into secrecy and scandal. Another overlooked detail settles in. Love letters between royals were sometimes censored or destroyed, either by officials or by the writers themselves, to avoid political misinterpretation. Even private words carried risk. A second gentle joke slips by. Imagine editing your feelings for national security reasons. You feel how lonely this must have been, surrounded by people, watched constantly, yet emotionally isolated by design. Love, when it did bloom, often had to hide, coded in glances, rituals, or silence. And when love broke free anyway, history noticed. Elopements, abdications, scandals remembered precisely because they violated expectation. Love was memorable because it was disruptive. As your breathing slows, you sense the paradox fully. Royal systems demanded human bodies but feared human emotion. They needed people but not their hearts, and as that settles, you begin to recognize patterns that still echo today. because next you'll look at modern royal weddings and see just how much of this ancient machinery remains, polished, televised, but still quietly intact. You don't need to travel far to feel the echo. The centuries peel back just enough for you to recognize the shapes, processions, balconies, carefully timed smiles, now lit by camera flashes instead of torches. Modern royal weddings feel gentler, friendlier, almost casual by comparison. But as you watch closely, half awake and sinking deeper into the rhythm of history, you realize how much of the old machinery is still humming underneath. What modern royals still copy is more than aesthetic. It's structural memory. A mainstream historical fact grounds you here. Contemporary royal weddings, especially in constitutional monarchies, remain meticulously choreographed state events. Guest lists are curated to signal alliances. Seating arrangements reflect hierarchy. Every element is approved in advance. The stakes are softer now, but the logic hasn't vanished. You notice how public visibility remains essential. Live broadcasts, global audiences, social media clips looping endlessly. The crowd has expanded, but the purpose is familiar: legitimacy through observation. If millions watch, the union feels real, unquestionable. You've seen this before, just without bells and iron rings. Here's a quirky modern echo. Even today, royal brides often receive extensive training before marriage, media coaching, protocol lessons, body language instruction. Historians still argue whether this is about preparation or quiet assimilation, but the effect is familiar. Smooth the individual, preserve the institution. You catch yourself recognizing symbols, white dresses still dominate, veils still obscure. Balconies still stage kisses at just the right moment. The choreography hasn't changed, only the lighting has. A light joke drifts by gently. Same play, bigger audience, better microphones. Religion often remains present too, even when belief is optional. Ceremonies still borrow sacred language, ancient spaces, and ritual gravity. The aesthetic of holiness lingers because it signals continuity. Old things feel stable. Stable things feel trustworthy. There's an ongoing scholarly debate humming beneath the broadcast. Historians still argue whether modern royals consciously preserve these traditions or simply inherit them without question. Some choices feel deliberate, others feel automatic. Tradition has inertia. Another overlooked detail settles in. Modern royal weddings still generate massive economic impact: tourism, branding, merchandising. The feast never ended, it just monetized itself more efficiently. A second gentle joke slips by: medieval sugar sculptures walked so souvenir mugs could run. You sense how carefully emotion is still managed, just enough warmth, not too much vulnerability. Love is allowed now, but only the right kind, relatable but not destabilizing, human but symbolic. And for all the talk of modernization, certain lines remain uncrossed. Abdications still shock. Marrying the wrong person still sparks debate. The system tolerates change, but only within guardrails built long ago. As your breathing slows, you feel how history doesn't disappear. It adapts. It learns better manners. It smiles for the camera. And as the applause fades and the broadcast cuts away, something quieter remains: the final question. Why do these traditions still matter when their original dangers are gone? That's where you're drifting next. You drift past the cameras now, past the crowds, past the rehearsed smiles, into something softer and almost invisible. What remains after all this time isn't the danger or even the power, but the habit. Tradition, once a survival strategy, has learned how to outlive its own necessity. How tradition outlived its purpose is quieter than everything that came before. A mainstream historical fact anchors you gently here. Many royal wedding customs persisted long after the political, religious, and biological risks that created them had faded. By the 20th century, succession laws stabilized, medicine improved, and monarchies lost absolute power, yet the rituals stayed. Not because they were needed, but because they were expected. You sense how tradition becomes self-justifying. People stop asking why something is done and start saying this is how it's always been. Familiarity hardens into authority. Questioning feels like disruption, even when nothing is truly at stake anymore. Here's a quietly strange tidbit. Some royal households still maintain ceremonial roles that no longer serve a function, titles, gestures, even objects whose original meaning is forgotten. Historians still argue whether these remnants preserve cultural continuity or merely perform nostalgia dressed as importance. You notice how comforting ritual can be. Repetition soothes uncertainty. In a fast-changing world, old ceremonies promise permanence. They whisper that some things remain solid, even if that solidity is carefully curated. A light joke floats in, softer than before. Tradition is just peer pressure from dead people, but very well dressed. These customs also survive because they're good stories. They photograph beautifully, they invite awe, and awe is addictive. People like feeling connected to something older than themselves, even if that connection is symbolic rather than practical. There's an ongoing scholarly debate humming at the edge of this calm. Historians still argue whether modern audiences instinctively sense the original power behind these rituals or simply enjoy them as spectacle. Do we feel the ghost of control or just the glow of pageantry? Another overlooked detail settles in. Tradition often protects institutions from scrutiny. When something feels ancient, it feels earned. Longevity becomes a shield. Ritual answers questions before they're asked. You think back. Veils, rings, beds, kisses, feasts, fabric, gossip. None of it was random. All of it once mattered urgently. And now it lingers like an echo in a grand room long after the speakers have left. As your breathing slows, the edges soften. These traditions no longer threaten. They no longer trap. They simply remain, polished, televised, symbolic. Powerful, not because they control lives, but because they shape imagination. And that's where you rest now, in the quiet realization that history doesn't vanish when it's no longer needed. It becomes bedtime stories, familiar shapes, gentle echoes you can drift past without fear. Your mind loosens its grip on detail. The images blur, the weight lifts, the hall empties, the candles dim. The noise fades into something distant and harmless. And you're safe to sleep. Now the pacing slows, the sentences stretch, and everything grows softer. The rituals dissolve into shadow. The echoes lose their edge. Nothing is demanded of you anymore. No witnesses, no proof, just rest.